Good evening, and welcome to 7 Stories Up. We are delighted to have you joining us this evening at the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Library. My name is Cynthia Chaldikis, and I'm a librarian here at SNFL. Before I introduce tonight's guests, I would like to thank the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Library for making programs like this evening's conversation possible. I'd also like to remind you, if you don't have a library card, they're easy to get. You can speak to my colleague at the table when you leave, or you can go to any of the reference desks below. Finally, I'd like to encourage you to visit NYPL's website and take a look at the upcoming 7 Stories Up programs. Tonight, I'm excited about our program with author Eric Klinenberg, who will discuss his book, 2020, One City, 7 People, and the Year Everything Changed. In February 2020, I was sitting at my desk at work and watching a time-lapse video on the New York Times website of a major hospital being built in Wuhan, China, in response to the virus that was crippling their country. There were many articles about the virus and what was happening to the other side of the world. In New York City and at the library, it was business as usual. Shortly after, in the paper, it was reported that someone had the virus and lived in New Rochelle, and his office was near Grand Central Station. And I thought, certainly he comes to the library to pick up his books, like everyone else, not to mention all the tourists who come to visit the library. The virus must have been all over the city at that point. It was. We just didn't realize it. The theaters decided to cancel their season. The museums closed up, and eventually the library closed too. But when I look back on it now, it was already too late. I read a book about the influenza pandemic of 1918 a few years back. I never thought something like the pandemic of 2020 could happen, and here it was in all its devastating glory. It's now my pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers. Eric Klinenberg is the Helen Gould Shepard Professor in Social Sciences and Director of the Institute of Public Knowledge at New York University. He's the author of many books and articles, most notably Palaces for the People, where Eric celebrates the importance of public libraries. Joining him is Kim Phillips-Fein. She is the Robert Gardner Kenneth T. Jackson Professor of History at Columbia University. She is an author, and her articles have appeared in the Journal of American History, the New York Times, and other notable publications. Without further ado, please welcome Eric Klinenberg and Kim Phillips-Fein.
Hi.
That was a long walk we had to take over there.
Yes, it did feel like a long walk.
I grew up in Chicago, and I think they pioneered that thing where when the basketball players come on the court, there's like pump-up music and the big spotlight. And I mean, that wasn't quite that, but it was pretty. For the library, that was pretty good, right?
That was close.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's very special to be here, to look at people together here, to be together, and to talk about this book. It's also, I think, especially at this time of year, I think the way the light is at this time of year, as the days just start to get a little bit longer, as it gets just a little brighter and a little warmer, I think for many of us, the city at this time of year, it will be a long time before it stops bringing back, in a very physical sense, how it was in March of 2020. So it's very special to be here. Thank you for inviting me, and it's a wonderful book and wonderful, I think, to have the chance to think and to talk about it and to start to make sense of this remarkable episode as you do in this book, and to have the chance to do it together. So I guess the first question I wanted to ask you is what do you think? So this is maybe also the first spring since the pandemic began when I know I at least have really gone out without a mask regularly. I don't think I would have done this really without a mask probably even a year ago. And why? So at this moment, when it seems as though things are not over, but the situation is different, it has changed, why is this the moment to go back and to think about 2020 again?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's actually a question for all of you. Like, what of all the things you could be doing on this beautiful night in New York City, like, why are we all here talking about 2020? Maybe we all need like one great shrink for this question, and part of it is probably just like we need to process something. But let me give you three explanations. Before I do, let me say thank you, Kim, for doing this event. I don't think this was mentioned in the introduction, but Kim wrote one of the great books about New York City, Fear City. And if you haven't read it, it's like one of these books I kept by my shelf when I was writing my book as a model of the kind of thing I wanted to do. So I'm really honored that you're here. And I also just want to say, this is the first book talk I've given in this new Stavros Niarchos Foundation library. And wow, like, have you all just taken a second to look around? It's kind of amazing that we live in a city that has a library like this. So it's a thrill to be here, and thank you to the New York Public Library for hosting me. I want to give you three reasons why I think it's important for us to talk about 2020. And the first one I'm going to do by way of a little anecdote. I was watching the news a few months ago, and the previous president was on, as he sometimes is. And he was doing a political rally in New Hampshire before the primaries. And he said this completely amazing thing. He said to this group of people who were assembled, I want you to ask yourself, are you better off now than you were 5 years ago? And like something just felt off about that statement to me, and I was trying to figure it out. And I realized that actually the political candidates in his position, like from the minority party running for office, have been asking that question for generations, but he got the phrase wrong. But he didn't mean to get the phrase wrong, because like the question he's supposed to ask is like, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago, right? Right, like when I was in office. But he didn't ask that. He asked 5, and it turns out he did this on a number of occasions. Like, it wasn't a mistake; it was a strategy. And there's a theory, I think, that's implicit in the strategy, and the argument is, the theory is, 2020 shouldn't count. It was an anomaly. No one saw it coming. Yes, things went a little haywire, but don't blame me for it. It was this huge event. It was, how could you hold me responsible for a crisis like this? And it turns out that that's not just him. That's like a talking point for one of the political parties now. Like, don't think about what happened in 2020. And the theory of the case is crises are anomalous. But my theory of the world today is that we live in this age of extremes. So 2020, the book is not just about the pandemic. It's about all these things that happened. But 2020 kind of began with a new pathogen. But you know what? There's going to be more pathogens. And like, hypothetically, imagine you lived in a world that had global warming and nuclear Iran and Russia and Ukraine and Israel and Gaza and artificial intelligence, right? A reasonable society would want to think about how suited a leader was to handle a crisis, right? And so rather than count this as an anomaly, like, it's precisely the kind of thing that we should be looking at. So that's like the first reason I think we should talk about 2020 is that we're in 2024 and we have the same presidential election shaping up. And it's important for us to have the record. Second reason I think we should study 2020 and that we should be here talking about this is that and I wrote a little essay in the New York Times a few weeks ago making this argument. We've been talking about long COVID as a medical condition, which it is, and a really serious one, potentially with lots of long-term implications. But long COVID is also a social condition, and we're still in it. And by that, I mean, it wasn't exactly the case that before 2020, everything was fine in America, and those are the good old days. We were distrustful, we were divided, we were agitated. But 2020 accelerated those trends and hardened them in ways that I think we need to understand. Like during the year 2020, we became more divided than we were, and we'll get into that, I hope, tonight. We became more distrustful of key institutions, of scientists, of the scientific institution, of each other. And that's playing out in our world today. There's a way in which our blood started to really boil in 2020, and it's still at a temperature that's not sustainable. And I think we have to figure out how and why that all happens. That's the second reason. And the third reason is really like the most fundamental for me. I'm a sociologist, and for my entire career, a lot of my work has been motivated by this idea that crises reveal things. If we look closely at what happens during a crisis, we can learn who we are, we can learn what we value, we can learn whose lives matter. And so we're all accustomed to this idea kind of in the world of politics that, you should never let a crisis go to waste, right? Politicians say that. The thesis of like Naomi Klein's Disaster Capitalism book, right, is firms realize this. It's also an opportunity for social scientists, right? Like we don't have particle accelerators. We can't spend trillions of dollars or billions of dollars to change the way social life works. But when something big and significant happens, we should pay attention because the world expresses itself. So I think for me, that's like the biggest license for doing this. Like we need to make sense of 2020 because it gives us a window into understanding things that we otherwise might not know.
I think that there's more to say about each of those points that you raise, but maybe just to give people a clearer sense of what this book is like and how, because I think the book raises a question, how do you do that? How do you make sense of this event? How do you do it? I'm a historian, so we work with archives and so on, and the benefit in a way time is the medium. You can't really write histories of things that just happened 4 years ago. How did you go about trying to make sense of, trying to understand, trying to get meaning from this incredible development?
Well, so partly it was that I got locked into the pandemic situation at a very early moment. In the first weeks of the crisis, I kind of had the sense that something big was about to happen. I didn't know how big or what it would involve, but I understood that we were going into this moment. And I heard, do you remember when the WHO and all the city agencies and state agencies said, we have this new disease, and the way that you should protect yourself is you should get socially distanced. Remember social distance? Okay, and actually in some weird ways, we're still pretty distanced. And I heard this phrase and I understood what they were trying to convey. But the way I entered this debate and started looking at the event is I had the sense that there was something wrong about that plea. And I wrote a different op-ed for the Times, and I said, my first book was a book about a heat wave in Chicago where hundreds of people died, largely from isolation. And I knew that social distance, the mandate of social distance told people like lock your doors, protect yourself, take care of your family, and come out when it's all over, which might work well for some people, but was destined to leave a lot of really vulnerable people to suffer or worse. So I wrote this article and I said, like, actually what we need to get through this crisis is physical distance and social solidarity. And I thought, like, well, wouldn't it have been a different experience if the messaging from the beginning was physical distance, social solidarity? That's how we get through this. And so I got, and it turned out that message resonated with people, and I started, like, I was on the beat, and I was like, I've got to follow this. So the strategy was, you probably remember this, like, I don't want to, this book is not a TikTok of 2020. I'm not asking you to relive all this stuff, and it's not a political history. It's like, one of the things I try to do is capture these moments and these debates because a lot of things popped up. I mean, actually, so much happened to us in so little time that it was really difficult to process at the moment, right? It wasn't just the COVID. There was an economic free fall. Millions of people lost their jobs. The markets crashed. A lot of people had the sense like, well, are my savings gone? Will my job ever come back? I mean, there was this like vertiginous moment where you didn't really know how it was all going to come out. And then the police murdered George Floyd. And then there were these historic civil rights uprisings, right? The movement for Black Lives. And our cities emptied out. You know, this one went through its own city abandonment thing. And there was a spike in violence. And then there was an attack on the democratic system, right? Culminating in January 6th. And that, like, none of us could process all that stuff. So my strategy was to try to like isolate specific things. So an example, when I say crises reveal things, here's one issue that I try to really treat in the book so that we can process it. Does anyone remember that there was a time when things were so bad, we had to stay at home, and the government said to us, the only people who should really be going to work are these people we call essential workers. Remember essential workers? Okay. So anyone feel like you've been talking a lot about essential workers in the last few weeks or months? Okay, it's gone, right? Let's not let it go away. Can we talk about what just happened? You know, because this is like, let's all think about what we did here. The world is falling apart, right? Anyone here live in New York City, by the way? Okay, we all know who the essential workers are. They're the bankers, the finance guys, right? They're the white shoe law firms, right? Maybe the guys who play basketball at Madison Square Garden, right? We all know who the essential workers are in New York City. But when push came to shove, and we didn't know whether we were going to survive, right? We did this thing, which is we took this open secret. Like, we all actually know who the essential workers are in New York, and we knew before 2020. We just don't say it, and we don't value the labor and protect the people. So we did this thing, which is that we spoke the open secret, and we all put it in the front pages, and the president said it, and we all said, like, who are the essential workers? Well, of course, there's doctors and nurses and people who work in hospitals, but also, you know, custodians, right, and clerks, and the transit workers in the MTA who kept on going, and people who are repairing infrastructure, people working in meatpacking plants, people working in poultry plants, agribusiness, like that. Those are and for the most part, they're low-wage workers. They're disproportionately black. They're disproportionately Latino, right? Now, one would think that when we say these are the essential workers, what we're also doing is we're making a moral commitment, right? It's an honorific to be called essential in the midst of a societal crisis where things are falling apart. You're essential. At a minimum, I'm honoring you. But there's a moral commitment. It's like maybe we should be compensating you better. We should guarantee that you have high quality healthcare if you get sick. What about like a mask and PPE, right? All those things, right? That's what you might expect a society to do when it says they're essential workers. But this is the United States of America, right? And so what it meant in America to be called essential was to be deemed expendable. And so what happened to essential workers is that they had these extraordinarily high levels of COVID and extraordinarily high levels of mortality. And many of them worked in crowded neighborhoods, right? Do you remember those maps in the beginning of the pandemic, the first months? Where I look at the New York Times every day. Then they had those like color-coded maps, and you could see which parts of the city were dark red. And there was this cluster of neighborhoods in Queens. It was like Corona and Elmhurst and Jackson Heights and Rego Park. Well, what was distinctive about those neighborhoods? They're places that had a lot of essential workers and that had residential crowding. So not only were the essential workers expendable, but they were going home, and then they were spreading the disease to their families, to their roommates, to the people close to them. What's strange about it is that thing happened, and there was this moment where it felt like we're walking to the edge of this moral precipice, and we're about to do something different, right? Did anyone else have that feeling? There were moments in 2020 where you're like, we're about to make a better world. We're saying these things. We're doing these things. You can imagine something better. We wound up reducing child poverty, right? We did these extraordinary things, and we got there, and just at that moment, we're like, nah, let's go back to regular life. And now here we are. And so that's one of the ways, like you reveal something. And I think that one reason that there's as much kind of distrust in this, that so many Americans feel, regardless of their political party, there's a sense a lot of people have now. It's not loneliness. It's this feeling of being on our own. Like we're not really sure that the core institutions of our society are going to stand up for us. It's because we experience this feeling of dropping and falling and thinking maybe we're being lifted and then dropped again. And it's in us still.
I wonder if you can just talk a little bit more about the way the structure of the book and how because the book it has a very distinctive structure that it's really a set of profiles at its heart. Or in a way, what you do is you tell the stories of 7 people in particular, their lives and experiences of COVID and the COVID year of 2020, and through them you get to these larger ideas and to a larger discussion of the different policies that both the U.S. and other countries developed and used during the height of the pandemic. Yeah. So that it really moves from these very specific stories to these very large questions. That's another thing that makes it feel like a very New York book. You both get a sense of the individual people and then seeing them together in this larger context.
Yeah.
And so I wonder if you can just describe the people a bit, how you found them, who they are, because it is a set of wonderful portraits of a group of people and their experiences that year.
Yeah, so again, in case you haven't been able to tell, I'm a sociologist. So I think like the way that we just went through, like I think kind of analytically, and I try to make comparisons, and there's some abstraction involved in the way that my mind usually works, and a lot of the book deals with that kind of stuff. There's a chapter in the book on why were masks so contentious and controversial in the U.S. but not in other places, and why did we have this spike in violence, even in things like reckless driving in the U.S., and why didn't have it in other places, or like how was Australia able to build trust, and have less death than they have during a typical year. So there's lots of like analytic questions where my sociology brain was really operating in that way, and that was satisfying to do in terms of like my puzzle solving, interest. But what I realized as I was working on those chapters or just thinking about them in the beginning is that like I'm not just a brain, but there's like this whole other body and thing attached to me. And one of the things that happened to my whole being in the first weeks and months of COVID is like I was really scared. I was really terrified, actually. Like it was, I don't know, did anyone else feel scared in the first months of COVID? It was really hard to be in New York City and hard to be in New York. And it's like, I remember the book starts with, I tell the story about my own family. Like I'm married, I have 2 kids, and I have my son was 13 at the time, and he's a soccer player, and he's like full of energy and always running around and never tired. And in the beginning of March, I was out of town. I was coming back, and his grandmother was staying with him because my wife was also traveling. And I land super early in the morning, and I call, and she says, Eric, your son has he's got a fever. His fever spiked, and it turned out that, like for a week at least, he had this really high fever, and he was sweating at night, and he had a headache, and he was so tired, like he could not get off the couch, and it sure sounded like COVID, right? I mean, but it was early March, and so also the United States of America, which meant you couldn't get a test, right? There were no tests for COVID, and I didn't want to take him to the hospital because that was the worst place on earth you could be, and that's a weird feeling. And I looked to see what to do, and remember the advice at the time for like what you're supposed to do if someone in your house has COVID. You put them in their room, right? and you close the door, you isolate them. Remember this advice? You isolate them in their room, and then you sort of like slide some food under the door, right? But I'm not just a person who reads the newspaper and gets advice. I'm also a human being, and the human being in me knows that, like, I'm a parent, and my kid has got this thing that feels like COVID. I'm going to be there with my kid, right? And so my wife and I, of course, are like with our kid, and then my wife is coughing. Right? So the beginning of this thing for me was marked by this like very visceral sense that things were falling apart. And at the same time that I'm trying to puzzle out the story of what's happening, I'm like trying to be a human being getting through this thing. And I'm guessing most of you look pretty human to me, so I'm guessing that you had the same experience. And at some point, I realized that there's this other tradition in my field of sociology, which I needed to tap into, which is not just about explaining the answers to tough analytic questions, but it's about like advancing the project of deep understanding, like understanding the experiences of people who are different from you. And my first impulse was like, I want to try to understand people in different countries around the world, but COVID, so the borders were closed and you couldn't go anywhere. And I thought like, well, if you're going to try to track the world, what better place could you be than New York City, where like we kind of have the world here? So I changed the plan, and I decided I was going to try to tell the story of a person from every borough. I was tracking the kind of events and the issues in each borough. I actually got a great grant from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and I hired a team of research assistants, and I was really Operation Central, on my laptop, like just trying to monitor what was happening. And I tried to find a person in every borough whose story I thought kind of told a story that was important for their borough. And that's a really hard thing. Obviously, that's bullshit. But I did my best to do it well. I really wanted to find someone. And at the end of that experience, I had 5 people. And I thought, like, okay, what am I really missing here? And I realized at first, okay, like I'm missing the story of someone who died very early because I was trying to track people who were able to talk to me. And so I found the family of a custodian in the MTA, a guy named Matai Tankachan, who was an Indian immigrant here 30 years ago. He was trained as a mathematician and a physicist, and he spent 3 decades working as a janitor, custodian in the subway system. So his kids could make it. And one of his sons, Matthews, is in law school at St. John's, and he really wanted to tell his father's story to me, and the MTA connected us, and so I was able to kind of reconstruct Matai's story. And then if you look at the screen to your right, the person on the cover is the 7th person. Like the other big story I missed is the story of the Black Lives Matter movement, which obviously is a huge part of the year of 2020 in the U.S. and in New York in particular. And Brandon he's a fascinating guy. He's a 6'6" black man who is a political photographer, and he likes to do things like go to KKK rallies and photograph the people doing it. And so he's a bit of a troublemaker, and he got really wrapped up in the protests of the year, and so he became the 7th person. So the way the book works structurally is like you spend some time trying to work out a puzzle, like what happened to essential workers and why masks were the issue that they were, and between each of the more analytic chapters, we go really deep into one of these profiles. And I was a little bit lucky because just before the pandemic started, I had been working on this, like the first profile I ever wrote for the New Yorker, and I loved doing it. It was a profile of a landscape architect named Kate Orff. And I learned so much writing her story and getting really deep into this. I was like, I think the technique I'm going to use it is similar to the technique I'd use in doing a profile like that. So what I found, what was really rewarding about it is that all those traumas that I just described that I experienced, like I kind of like locked them up and tried to bury them someplace inside of me, because to be honest, there was so much that we had to live through in 2020 that I think that was like a pretty basic survival strategy, just like kind of get through it and lock it up. And each person in the book kind of helped me personally just like unlock something so that I could process it. And I want each of the stories there to kind of help you as a reader do the same thing. Like really, not in the stories I think are actually very human, and
Yeah.
many of them are pretty uplifting.
Yeah.
So it's not like saturating yourself in the experience of 2020 again, but it's like reminding us of this thing we lived through, because it's going to wind up being one of these years that all of us remember forever and tell stories about forever. So we should get closer to it.
I wonder if you can tell just a little bit more about a couple of the people who you spoke to, whose stories you tell.
Is there one you want to start with?
Well, actually, I would love for you to talk about Mei Lee, who is the person who is the opening profile of the book.
Okay, so there's someone from every borough, as you heard, and Mei is the Manhattan representative. And she doesn't really come first because she's from Manhattan or because she's awesome. She comes first because the crisis of 2020 started earlier for Mei than it did for almost everybody in the city. Mei, she's the principal of PS 22, which is an elementary school in Chinatown. And what's amazing about Mei is she grew up in Chinatown. She went to PS 42. Her husband went to PS 42. One of her children went to PS 42. It's her world. And when I say the crisis started early, it's because 80-some% of her students and their families are Chinese American. And they're generally connected to family in China. And so they started getting messages from family in late December, January, that there's this new virus, all these WeChat messages. And so kids were showing up with masks. Parents were showing up with masks. Some kids stopped coming to school. There was all this chatter. The white gentrifier families in the Lower East Side, they were totally freaked out because they had no idea what was going on. And Mei could sense that there was this crisis brewing. The other thing that happened is that it's Chinatown, full of Asian American people, but you might recall the president at the time thought it would be a really good idea to talk about COVID as the China virus, right? The Kung flu, remember all this stuff? And so one of the definitive features of the US, and other societies did this as well, is there was this incredible spike in anti-Asian hate crimes here. And Mei was at her favorite, newsstand, the place, the little shop where she gets stuff every day. And a woman came in and just started harassing her, for being Chinese American in Chinatown. And she was in charge of all these kids. And she said, there's so much of this going on right now that I don't feel comfortable having my kids walk around on field trips. So she cut field trips off. Then the school closed down. And she realized that there are, all these kids who are now living in multifamily households with bunk beds in the rooms. And it works if everybody's out at work during the day, but everyone's kind of locked in. And the city's plan for remote school, relied on kids having machines, and the kids didn't have machines. So the city said we're going to spend a lot of money. We're going to send you tablets. But I don't know, has anyone ever lived in Chinatown or seen the apartments? They're all doorbells on the outside of the building, right? The buzzer's on the outside of the building, and nobody's answering the door for the delivery guy in the midst of the pandemic, and you can't leave the tablets on the streets of Chinatown. So Mei had all of the tablets delivered to her school, and she basically enlisted her kids and her husband, and then they all walked around from door to door and called the families until they could hand deliver each of these things, right? Mm. And then Mei realized she knew this, but she was upset because, the school, we talk a lot about what it meant to close the schools, but the school's not just about learning. It's a community hub, right? It's where people connect and share information. It's where kids get food, right? There's more than 1 million kids in New York City who depend on the public schools for food every day, and breakfast, lunch, a snack. So she was closed, and she had to fight the Department of Education to open up her school so that they could serve meals and try to do it outside. And so Mei's story is kind of important because, first of all, it's a reminder of just how committed to their community so many people are and what they're willing to do for it. Also, our vulnerability and susceptibility. Mei was dealing with breast cancer while this happened. Her husband got COVID over the course of this, these weeks. It's like a really tough environment. And also, I think what's important about the story of May is that, like a lot of people, even though she was connected and working, she shared this feeling that the institutions she was relying upon for support weren't really able to give her what she needed. And she was only going to be able to take care of her community if she fought like hell. And so she just did. And I like starting the book with her because everything happened so quickly there. But also, like, it makes it clear that the year was not just a kind of catalog of horrors. The year was also about a fight, and an organized fight of people doing these pretty amazing things. And she's a very ordinary person. Like, she's very humble. She just looks like one of us. But I think a lot of people who look like one of us did amazing things that year, and we should know that.
Another story you tell, which has a similar type of theme, is that of Nuala Doherty, and COVID care in Queens. I wonder if you could tell a little bit about that story, because I think it illustrates a number of things that are connected to Mei Li's story, but also pick up on different aspects of the city at that time. Yeah,
it's a story of solidarity, and because I think I kind of feel like everybody's probably a little tired listening to me for a second. We were sitting in the back, and you actually told me this amazing story about solidarity, which I want you to share with everybody, if you don't mind, about your parents.
Oh,
you asked me what solidarity means.
Right.
And we started because Nuala is a solidarity story. But before we get there, remember the thing with the banging the pots and pans, and remember that was like Kim said, what does solidarity mean? So I was like, what does solidarity mean to you?
Right. Well, I was telling Eric before this began, my parents are actually both retired doctors. My father was a general internist, and my mother was a pediatrician at a Brooklyn clinic for her career. And my parents are perhaps the last people, or they may be the only people in New York who are still going outside every night, essentially at 7 p.m. to clap and cheer and actually say, Eric, when you were talking about the essential workers, you were saying, remember, they go out and say, remember the essential workers. They've gotten some of their neighbors. They live in Brooklyn, in Boerum Hill, and are doing this nightly. And I guess this is, I told my mother I was coming here tonight to talk about Eric's book, and she said, oh yes, well, you should mention us for sure. And then she said, well, we're doing this because I was like, well, are you sure? Do your friends know that you're doing this? She said, well, yes, of course, everybody knows we're doing it. And then she said, well, yes, and also we're doing this because I think for them, it both actually is a question of remembering the essential workers and wanting to. But she said also, I just think the pandemic really hasn't ended for the city in many ways. And that even though the situation is different, the pandemic has not ended and its impact on the city hasn't disappeared. And I guess this is a version of solidarity, or a kind of a form of collective remembering and wanting to think together and just to say something happened here and we're still in a state of mourning for some and acute, I guess, having lived through a period of acute transformation for others. And then she mentioned, I guess she said, and right now I'm thinking about children and the lost time, not being in school, and the academic and social effects that had, and what that meant for people. So, but I think it's a larger set of questions.
Yeah.
So,
I interpret them not so much as mourning as just like trying to bang the drum of solidarity to kind of like keep the fire going and remind us.
Right.
In the same way that there's long COVID, there should also be long solidarity. In a way, the challenge of our time is to channel the energy of those moments and to carry that forward. So Nuala, in some ways, Nuala is a person who does that, and this is an amazing person. I think in the beginning I described her as like 5'2" in heels, and she said I'm not even close to 5 feet in heels. She's great. She's an amazing New Yorker. She's born to Irish immigrant family. She's the only person in her family who's born in the U.S. about a year after they got here. And she moved to New York for high school. She went to St. John's Law School. moved to Astoria, kind of got really into like bodega culture in Astoria. She married an Ecuadorian guy who is a auto technician, and they moved to Jackson Heights. They got a family. Sometimes other people in the extended family move in with them. They bought a house. She's like involved in the neighborhood. She worked as a district attorney in Manhattan for 30 years, and her specialty was busting Latin American drug gangs. And then she retired just before 2020. She decided she wanted to run for local office. And she was running this really ill-fated campaign. It was not going well. Even though she's great, this wasn't happening for her on this thing. And she has good friends who are out in the world and who were like suddenly sick with COVID. And she realized, okay, there's this new disease going around. It's a pretty serious one. This neighborhood, Jackson Heights, could be in some trouble because residences are really crowded. There's a lot of people in a household in Jackson Heights. People are, if there's an essential workforce, it's here. Everybody's out. It's kind of like a cash underground economy, right? A lot of people are like off getting paid off the books. They're not necessarily enrolled in, eligible for whatever public benefits that are going to be out there. We better do something. So she does this incredible thing. She writes on like a notepad, if you need help, call me, and she writes her phone number. And then she has her family member, volunteers, staff people put the posters up around Jackson Heights. So like the next day there's dozens of people calling, and then it's hundreds of people calling, right? Her phone is, you can't even get through on her phone because everybody needs something. Everyone needs help. So then Nuala says well, I got an idea. And she does another post-it. If you can help, call me. Dozens, then hundreds of people. So Nuala creates, in the basement of her house in Jackson Heights, the COVID Care Neighborhood Network, which is important because it's a case of what we've come to appreciate and call mutual aid networks. Right? Anyone here participate in a mutual aid network or get something or do something in mutual aid? It's a huge thing that happened in New York City and in cities around the world. People started to take care of each other. Because governments were not responding fast enough, nimbly enough. People started to take care of each other. And they started with food and with diapers and with cleaning supplies and with like basic services for people who, what do you do if someone dies in your home? What do you do if both parents have COVID and you've got kids? How do you figure out where you should get treated if you don't know things? Like they're just handling all these things, and there are all these volunteers who are showing up. And then as like the seasons changed and things started to open up a little bit, the problems changed. So, there was a moratorium on evictions. But some landlords tried to evict their tenants anyway, because what do immigrants know? So then people would connect with each other, and Nuala would provide legal support because she was an attorney. And then it turned out like Jackson Heights, massive density, lots of crowding, not easy access to green space and parks. So Nuala and her team, like her collaborators, they became the leaders for this Open Streets initiative to turn 34th Avenue into a park, which they succeeded at doing. So then there was a fire in a building, and they helped to get the residents rehoused and situated. And it's like an amazing story of, Nuala's, she doesn't like to take the credit for all this. She just happens to be the stand-in for this collection of people, who did a lot of great stuff. And she's just a spark plug. But what's important is that she stands for this really kind of amazing essential movement of people at the local level, especially I think in poor immigrant neighborhoods, who were like, we're going to find a way to support each other. And it's a kind of amazing story, and this is what reminded me of your parents too. About a month ago, the editor of New York Magazine said we really want to run the excerpt of Nuala because she's such an amazing New Yorker in the magazine. Before we run the excerpt, could you just give her a call and find out what she's doing now? So I was, of course, so I called up Nuala, and Nuala's like one of the people I got to know the best. I spent the most time like walking around with her and really seeing her world, and I knew she was going to respond, and So, hey, Nuala, what's going on? So she said, oh, I'm so busy, you wouldn't believe. Oh, what's going on? Well, my husband's Ecuadorian, and we have like extended family. And the other day, this woman called, and she had a friend who's here. She's trying to get her asylum papers in, and it was really complicated to do this asylum paperwork. Any chance you would just help her out? I've never done any asylum stuff, but sure, so this woman comes over, and Nuala works with her on her asylum papers. And then this woman texts her friends, hey, I got this great person. And then a few people, call Nuala. And then she says, within a few weeks, it's 4 a.m. in Jackson Heights, and there's a group of people sleeping outside of her house. So now Nuala's got a neighborhood network, and the volunteers, people who worked on the COVID care network, come and help her. And the next thing you know, the same basement in the same house in Jackson Heights that was the COVID care neighborhood network turns into the Jackson Heights Immigration Center. And you think I'm kidding, you got to look at New York Magazine and look at the photographs. Every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, people start lining up on the open street at 34th Avenue at 8:30 in the morning, because she had to have them meet there so they wouldn't come in front of her house anymore and wake them up. Then at 10 o'clock, they get walked over to her home. She gets about 60 people into her basement. There's a staff of volunteers. She does a lecture, which is kind of like a welcome to America. Welcome. We're all New Yorkers. You're all New Yorkers now, kind of lecture, how to live. Then it turns into a legal clinic. They spend the afternoon and the evening helping each family process their paperwork. By December, she had personally processed with this immigration center more than 2,000 applications for 2,000 families seeking asylum, which matters because when you get it, when the INS or IC, whoever it is, when they don't respond to you within 6 months, because they can't, you get a Social Security card. Now you can work, right? And what it reminded me of is that there's this legacy of 2020, which is how angry we are at each other and how divided we are and despondent, and young people don't trust government and they're not going to vote in 2024, and there's all this stuff that we worry about, and we should be worried about it. But also there is, because of 2020, this hidden civic infrastructure in New York City. And I think in a lot of places around the world where people are doing things for each other and engaging local politics in ways that they hadn't done before. And it's kind of exciting. And in some way, when I think about the future, and I'm as terrified as anyone about what we're about to live through in 2024, but if I think about what's coming, I kind of feel like the battle is between the distrust and the cynicism and giving up on everything and anger, and this kind of other thing, which we would do well to remember, which is when push came to shove, a lot of us really did stand up for each other and go to work. And I don't know anybody in New York who represents this better than Nuala.
Well, I think that's actually a lovely point to open up to the audience for questions and reflections and questions.
Yeah, so there's a lot to talk about here. We could be talking about it for a long time. We don't have a lot of time. So just want to make sure, please ask questions, no statements. Just one question per person so we can give as many people as possible a chance. Thank you very much. We got anybody here?
Raise your hands on this side. Here we go.
Okay.
Actually, if you don't mind, just kind of standing up so we can see you and maybe say where you're from.
Hi, my name is Carl, and I live in Queens. And yeah, thank you. My experience during COVID was quite different than most people, I think. In the beginning, I had all the same fears that everywhere I go, I might catch something, right? I was also a social worker. I worked for the MTA, so I had to go to work every day. But in a strange way, COVID was great for me. Personally, I know it's terrible for millions of people around the world, but I was able to commute to work in half the amount of time. I came home and I had the exact same parking spot in front of my house for a year. Okay? Most of the people in my office were allowed to work from home. My stress levels went from up here down to here because there was hardly any stress in the office. The bond and stock market took a big hit. I was able to move my mom's money out of the low-yielding account into high-yielding bonds that in 1 year recouped back to its original value. And the same thing
So when you
happened
saw
with
there was an
stocks.
event about 2020, or you thought, where's the party at?
You know, so and I was able to go to places in New York City in half the amount of time, bring my dog, let them run around the park
Yeah.
and have fun.
Carl,
And-
I appreciate it.
So-
Is there a question you want to ask also? It's a useful reminder.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I guess what I'm trying to say is that if you don't look at everything as a negative, also look at some of the positives.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not saying that this was worth it.
Yeah.
Because COVID was horrible.
Yeah. Well,
And a
Carl,
lot of people paid the price for it.
Thank you for reminding us that. I appreciate the reminder that we had different experiences and also the question. And I guess I want to say, like, for me, by talking about the story of Nuala and May, who dealt with hardships, but who produced something I think really beautiful out of it, it's a reminder that it wasn't all horrible. Like there is something beautiful that came of it. But I think it is important for those of us who were fortunate enough to be, less threatened, to feel less vulnerable, to feel like maybe we could even take advantage of this moment and do something that we wanted to do, to remember that, like, we're not just individuals, and I think that's part of, like, what happened in New York City. We're all connected to each other, and there's a way in which what COVID reminded us is that if we try to get through things by just taking care of ourselves as individual people and not thinking about the collective, we're going to wind up with some really unequal outcomes. And I remember being at a wedding summer recently with a bunch of people who were in their early 30s when 2020 hit, and they didn't have kids. And the stories were about, like, oh, I went to Lisbon for 4 months, and oh, I went to Mexico City. The tacos are amazing there. And, as, like, someone who was trying to teach classes and dealing with a kid who was sick and, had children doing remote school and a spouse who was like a mother and a worker and a, cook and all, like, it was a very stressful and difficult time. It didn't make me happy to hear someone boasting about what a great year they had. And so just like, I appreciate that it was a different experience for different people. But the reality is that this is a year where we had massive amount of excess death, a massive amount of suffering. And the only way, like, collectively we flourish in these kinds of moments is if people who have the capacity to give participate in that. And my observation, getting to know the people like Nuala and May, is that actually it wasn't about, like, financial gain that they had out of it. It was like the act of helping other people and contributing to some bigger thing actually helped them feel significantly better about themselves and their city and their future. And one of the things I observed is the people who got really insular and locked their doors and just tried to hide, the echoes of the anxiety are still going.
Hi,
I know
Eric.
that voice.
Hi, my name is Judith Helfand. I live in New York City. I think my question is, what do you think the long-term impact is of so many people not being able to have the collective grieving rituals and the face-to-face, hug-to-hug, babka, shiva, serious memorials that we all know are so necessary, to never be able to catch up, to sort of not get that?
Judith, that's a profound question, and it's Judith made a documentary film out of the first book that I wrote, Heat Wave. So I really know that voice. Judith's a brilliant filmmaker who is New York based and who tells New York stories about things like, making sense of loss. And the story of the MTA worker, Matai Tankachan, began because I reached out to the MTA. I knew I wanted to talk to a family where someone had died. And I reached out to the MTA because the MTA did this gorgeous memorial this kind of digital display of the faces of the MTA workers who died in the first weeks of the pandemic. And the original question I asked them is how do you mourn, how do you honor, how do you memorialize people whose families didn't have that chance? And the MTA actually decided to take this on as a collective kind of organizational responsibility. It was an amazing thing. And the MTA actually, they struggled because, in the beginning of the pandemic, the WHO said there's no mask mandate. We don't want people wearing masks. And part of that was because they were really nervous that there wasn't going to be enough supply of masks and PPE for medical workers, right? So there wasn't a mask mandate, but the MTA initially said to transit workers, you're not allowed to wear a mask because it was a uniform violation. And they were trying. What do we know at the time, right? But I think they felt the sense we didn't, we got that wrong, and they really wanted to do right. And there's this amazing group of people. Sandra Bloodworth is one of the characters in the book. She runs the MTA Public Arts Program, and my way into the Tankachan family was to talk about memorializing the father they lost. And Judith, it's how do you make up for it? I don't know that you make up for it. I mean, there are these moments, and you can do it 6 months later. You can do it a year later. That this family did do it later, and it felt good to be with other people. But I think that it intensified the pain, and there was a real pain and a sense of despondency and isolation, and that's to say nothing of this other kind of really terrifying. I talked a little bit about the ways in which this traumatized us. For another study that's not in the book, with a postdoctoral researcher named Melina Sherman, we interviewed nurses who were working in hospitals where they had a lot of COVID death. And then it was the nurses, in many cases, who were responsible for helping dying patients communicate with their family. We remember the people, the iPad, FaceTime goodbyes. And it was interesting because you probably know that there's a real crisis in the healthcare industry right now, which we talked, nurses have left the job, and they're having trouble hiring people. And the rhetoric that is used in the industry is to talk about healthcare worker burnout. And what we felt is burnout is the wrong concept because it implies that it's a failing of the individual. I had this fire to do my job and now it's just gone. I'm burnt out. And it's not really burnout. It's what these healthcare workers experience is a kind of moral injury, a moral suffering. They worked in institutions that weren't set up to support them to do this really challenging work. And so they too were the families were mourning, and they had this feeling of mourning that they weren't able to deliver the kind of work they wanted to do at the moment when it counted. And so I can't tell you, Kim, how many healthcare workers I interviewed who said it was, on the one hand, amazing to hear the pots and pans, but also I knew as people were celebrating the work that we did that we weren't actually doing our best work, and we weren't able to, the conditions didn't allow it. And so it's those kinds of things that I think we need to process. I don't know the answer of how we do it, but I just think we need to be together and telling ourselves these stories, because it's this experience is in us. We all went through this thing. We all went through this at some level, whether directly or indirectly. And so the idea for writing this book, and I can't tell you how many people have been. This book sounds really interesting. It's way too early for me to read a book like that, But I think we have to. Mm-hmm. I think we have to face this thing for so many reasons.
Questions?
One more. We have time for one more. You can choose your side.
I will stick around after, and we can do one-on-one conversations.
Hi, my name is Victoria Trong, and I'm from Queens. So thanks for being here. I've actually read your book earlier, Eric. I think it's called something about solo life.
Oh, going solo.
Yes, going solo.
Yeah.
At a time in my life when I was experiencing a certain kind of loneliness, and I think in many ways, as a sociologist, I think your work seems to me to be about loneliness and the ways that people in society are affected by that. And I guess I'm wondering, since you mentioned that your book had certain hopeful narratives, like, do you think that the trend of atomization that was pointed out by your predecessor, Emil Durkheim, do you think that's reversible based on these sort of hopeful leadership stories that you uncovered in your book?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for bringing up Emil Durkheim. I try to bring up Emil Durkheim whenever I give a public talk. You did it for me today, so thank you for that. I think that there's nothing irreversible about the trend towards atomization. I mean, I'll full disclosure, I actually don't think it's very useful to talk about the situation we're in as an epidemic of loneliness, like the Surgeon General does. Loneliness levels are down substantially from where they were a few years ago, and loneliness levels have been, kind of within a pretty stable range for a long time. I kind of think of loneliness as a pretty human existential condition, like loneliness, happiness. They're kind of hard to measure and track in a consistent way over time. So for me, this issue of loneliness, and I think loneliness is a real problem that has real serious consequences. I'm not trying to dismiss it, but the phenomenon I'm trying to get at in the book is more like the feeling of being left on our own. In this essay I wrote for the Times a few weeks ago, I try to distinguish between loneliness and what I call structural isolation, which gets at this thing, like we're just not sure that there's someone who's got our back in this society. And it's actually the through line that runs through each of the characters. There's a guy in the book I write about from Staten Island named Danny Presti who got radicalized on the right over the course of the year because he was trying to run a bar business and the city kept shutting him down and the state was shutting him down, and he couldn't get the support he needed, and he realized either I'm going to go bankrupt because I'm not getting the support, or I'm going to stay open anyway. And he declared his bar an autonomous zone, and hundreds of people on the right came and rallied to his support. And he felt like the government wasn't there for him, But Nuala had to start the mutual aid network because she knew the government wasn't there for people in Jackson Heights. And, Mei Lee had to do all this work in her family because the Department of Education wasn't ready to support the school. So, the through line across the different, political parties was this feeling of the system's not working. And so do I think that we can bond together and come up with some fix to find a way out of this jam that we're in right now? And we are so in a jam in 2024, right? It's it's not going to happen this year. It's not going to happen this year. I feel like I've read enough history to know that we cycle in and out of these different places. And actually we've been in some places in America that feel a lot like this moment. Like I think about your book, Fear City. And there are a lot of people who felt at the peak of Fear City the way a lot of people feel today, which is it's never coming back. It's we're stuck in a really down time. And I'm not an organizer. I'm not a prophet. But I do think that there is enough shared experience of frustration and enough demand in doing something better that we will come up with some other way of organizing. And I hope we do it in the direction of the Nuala O'Dohertys and the mutual aid networks and the Mei Lees and the community bonding, and not in the direction that the previous president wants us to go in. But I think that's in some ways the question of our time. And so for tonight, we have to start asking, what are we going to do? Right? Because 2024 is new and starting. And I don't want someone to have to write a book on 2024 like I had to on 2020. All right. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.